Hello everybody and welcome back to another podcast here on the Essentially Explained channel. Today we're going to be talking about politics, more specifically the UK local elections and the by-election that occurred in Westminster. And we're also going to be talking about the UK's record-breaking economic growth numbers. And as always, to guide us along this journey, I am joined by Mr. Dan Marks. And Dan, what do you make of, well, firstly, I guess, of the election results that have been coming in?
You want my first reaction or my third?
We go with your first reaction, yeah.
My first reaction. Yeah, I'll try and mimic how it was yesterday. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Labour has been, well, I've used the phrase torn a new arsehole too much now, I guess. I can't think of another phrase. They've been torn a new arsehole. It's not gone well. Let's put it that way. They've been absolutely battered in England in the council elections, local council elections. They've done okay in Wales, it seems, but they haven't made any gains, which is what they were expecting. Which for a party in opposition to be just getting the same number of seats in Wales is not good. And then in England. Where do you even go? I mean, we haven't got the full result yet, so we should stress that we don't quite know the full layout yet. But the headlines are, as to today, I mean, this wasn't so bad yesterday because we hadn't had all the seats declared and councils declared. But Labour have lost 4 whole councils and 200 seats as the party in opposition, who have been in opposition for 10 years now. So it's fair to say Labour look like they might never get into government ever again.
Well, it's something that definitely is not out of the realm of possibility. I mean, maybe it's a bold claim to say they'll never get into government again, but definitely not in any near future, not in any scenario in the near future you can see them getting back into power. I mean, this is a massive blow to the Labour Party. As you said, as the party in opposition, they should really be taking the fight to the Conservatives in these local elections, which is what historically the party in opposition should be doing. But, well, as we said before, they've lost the seat of Hartlepool, which has, from memory, hasn't voted Tory in its entire history as a constituency, which is massive. And
yeah. Yeah, I mean, this was a seat that was newly formed in 1974. And, yeah, they've never turned a Tory MP ever. And not only have they now elected a Tory MP, they've elected it with a majority of over 6,000 votes, which for that constituency is a significant majority. And there was a swing of votes. So when we say a swing, we mean essentially people moving directly from Labour to Tory in this case of around about 80%, which is absolutely groundbreaking. I mean, that hasn't been seen on a national level ever. You'd only ever get that sort of figures or close to that under sort of like the Blair 2000s and late 90s sort of time period. They're the only sort of times you get them sort of figures.
Yes, and perhaps that raises the question of why has this happened? Why has the Labour Party been decimated once again in a round of elections? And obviously, in the 2019 election, Jeremy Corbyn, who was the leader of the Labour Party at the time, saw Labour, or took Labour to their worst electoral result since the 1930s, if I can remember my figures correctly. And, well, obviously, perhaps one might argue this is simply a continuation from that election result. And, well, as I've sort of alluded to earlier, obviously the Labour Party will have to look into why has this happened. And, I mean, Keir Starmer's come out and said that they've lost their connection with their voting base, which, I mean, you can't really argue with. They've lost both in the 2019 election and obviously in these local council elections, have lost what were previously thought as Labour strongholds. And perhaps there's probably a couple of reasons to this. I think perhaps the first one is that the Labour Party has lost their identity. I guess they're not really the Workers' Party as such. They're not. They don't really occupy a unique space on the political spectrum anymore. Especially not under Keir Starmer's leadership.
No, I was going to say not with the leadership, definitely not. There are various factions within the Labour Party that occupy, the more radical left with Corbyn and the more sort of centrist ground under the old Blairite sort of movement. But yeah, no, their leadership certainly doesn't seem to take a definitive stance, which is pragmatism, which makes sense, but doesn't really help when you're trying to vote based on issues.
No, I mean, I think the majority of people would say that Keir Starmer is more electable than, say, Jeremy Corbyn. But that's not really saying much when Jeremy Corbyn had, I think, what seemed like an endless train of scandal after scandal, or complications arising. You had his whole comments regarding certain terrorist groups. You had his rather radical left-wing policies.
Hmm.
I think that one of the biggest things was also the anti-Semitism. He oversaw, was in charge of a party which saw massive problems regarding anti-Semitism, and well, that shows he can't control his own party. He couldn't control his own party when he was a leader, and if you can't control your own party, how can you control, or how can you make the British people believe that you're, the one to be voted in to control a nation, basically? And by a large extent, Keir Starmer, I guess, is viewed as the sort of steady hand to guide Labour forward. But I think if you asked 90% of people in the street, 90%, if you ask people on the street, 90% of them will probably not be able to tell you what Keir Starmer stands for. What, for want of a better term, what is his USP? What vision of Labour does he have that would sway people back towards voting for the Labour Party? There's been questions raised about his lack of opposition to certain Tory policies. Perhaps obviously he's had his hands tied behind his back in regards to facing an incumbent government that has a significant majority. So his power to be able to resist is limited. But I don't know. I don't know what you think, like, regarding his sort of year in charge as the leader of the opposition.
It's been a weird time to Labour. I mean, it gives me sort of vibes of not the Corbyn days, not the Miliband days, but maybe the sort of Gordon Brown days, but sort of in opposition as opposed to government, because you sort of get the feeling that, I mean, the difference was back then is everyone knew that there was a big collapse coming, and the new leadership did nothing to stop that. But the case with Keir Starmer is that, I mean, he's been just as helpless to prevent the fall, but everyone anticipated that Labour would have, at least up till recently anyway, have made some gains into the Tory sort of dent. But it's been hard for Keir Starmer to try, and I think the main problem, as you said, is with his own party rather than, it is an image thing for him. I mean, we've spoken about this in the past, that Keir Starmer isn't a particularly remarkable politician, in the sense that describing him would be pretty difficult in 3 words or something like that, because he's a pretty ordinary guy. But his party seems to be the main issue, I would have said. It seems to be that he can't. I think he has in his own mind an agenda that he wants. He must do, but he has to go for a middle ground, because he has to appeal to both spectrums of his party. And if he doesn't, well, then he risks infighting and collapse again, just under Corbyn, like Corbyn had, and of course getting decimated in the polls. So it's been a weird year for him. I don't think he'll resign, not yet anyway. I think he's been in the job for far too little time for that, because Labour have gone through 3 leaders now in the space of just over 5 years, and well, exactly 5 years actually, near enough, and that means that clearly it's not a leadership issue, or if it was, it would be now. So I think there needs to be a big party restructure of some sort. There needs a definitive sort of new bold idea that people take on throughout Labour, and essentially a new Labour idea, but for 2021, something that gives the Labour Party a new image that the party can get behind and separates them from other parties to win elections, because they don't seem capable of doing that at the moment.
No, you're completely correct. We've seen this with parties of the past. You pointed out New Labour. Arguably, even the Conservatives, with their One Nation approach under Cameron, was an attempt to be able to reunify the Conservative Party, which has been fractured in opposition against Tony Blair. And, well, you talked about the number of Labour leaders, and I guess that's a good segue into comparing Keir Starmer to his predecessors. And I'm just to sort of put out that I am in complete agreement that I think it would be ridiculous for him to resign or to be, pushed from the leadership role, because ultimately he's had a year in opposition where we've had a pandemic. He's had been in reality, people might be angry, and we've seen evidence of this. Even people like sort of kicking him out of pubs and all that. But in reality, there's very little he could have done. In a practical sense, maybe vocally, he could have taken a stand on certain issues. But in practice, he had very little power. Now, so his two predecessors were Ed Miliband and Jeremy Corbyn, I think, right?
Yeah.
I'm correct in saying.
Yeah, they were the two predecessors for him. Yeah.
Yeah, and well, I guess they've both suffered their own issues. I mean, Ed Miliband was never going to be elected as Prime Minister. It doesn't come across badly at all as a politician. In recent interviews I've watched with him with various political pundits, I guess you could
Russell Brand.
I wasn't even thinking Russell Brand. I think I was watching an interview with him and Alistair Campbell the other day.
Oh, okay, yeah, Alistair Campbell is pundit's a nice word for him. he's literally the character that Malcolm Tucker is based off. So yes.
Although he seems to deny that claim every time.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, he'll deny that none of this is. He'll make sure that none of this is true and say, oh no, I've never done that and things. But he's even watched some of the episodes of The Thick of It and literally said, the thing where Malcolm Tucker's got two phones on his ears.
Yeah.
He's literally said he's done that very same thing. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, he was known to be quite a ruthless operator in his days in government. And
yeah.
Actually, that you brought up The Thick of It. That's a good point. For those that have a sort of vague interest in, I guess, UK politics, I couldn't recommend The Thick of It enough. It's bloody hilarious. Beyond giving, I guess, an insight. Obviously, it's not a documentary. It's not going to be 100% accurate.
No.
But I think it gives an insight into, I guess, the behind the scenes of a government department. In this case, the Department for Social Affairs and Citizenship. And it gives a little insight into the opposition and all that. So can recommend that. But yes, returning to the Ed Miliband and Jeremy Corbyn. Ed Miliband again was sort of restricted by the circumstances he was in. The country was in financial. I don't know if financial ruin is exaggerating the problem. But come off the financial crisis in about 2012, obviously in 2012, end of 2011, and entered recession as the effects of the financial crisis sort of permeated, or sunk down to sort of ground level. So it was quite difficult to judge his tenure in charge, I guess, beyond his own persona. And then obviously Jeremy Corbyn, beyond the issues were already outlined. I think he very much took Labour back to its old roots. I don't know if I'd be correct in saying that, but he seemed to take it back to what it was back in the 1970s.
Yeah. Corbyn was an interesting choice. Weirdly, what's strange is that Corbyn took a very similar position to the Labour of the 70s, and in the 70s that wasn't seen as really, really radical. I mean, they were seen as a socialist party, but it wasn't seen as sort of like a really radical agenda that's moved away from the sort of like the main UK sort of political landscape, the main sort of like centre ground. But Corbyn, with a very similar agenda just in the day today, really seemed to drag Labour out of that sort of common space for UK politics, didn't they? He seemed to almost come across as a very much a radical party. I mean, his agenda was reasonably radical, but you've got to remember that Labour has a much sort of much more interaction with its votes, with its membership, when it comes to policy and deciding on things. In the Tory party and parties before, it was very much the case that the leadership would decide the main party platform, so the manifesto and the policies. But Labour now has they essentially have a convention where they decide on the policy for the year or for the election, and leadership don't get a huge say in it. So Corbyn sort of has to accept whatever was coming across either way. But I'm pretty sure they aligned very well with what he wanted anyway.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. And as we already mentioned before, I think the biggest the biggest problem for Labour is finding what space they do occupy, or finding a new space in order to sort of. I don't think they're going to be able to ever go back to being the Workers' Party as such, because that's an outdated concept. Ultimately, most people work in the services industry, not in mining, which is what I guess you would traditionally think of Labour as sort of representing the sort of northern or sort of more deprived areas. These days they tend to do stronger in, say, London, which you wouldn't exactly, expect to be full of, traditional working class people. There's more seen as a sort of services based metropolis, as you were. But yeah, just to sort of round off the sort of political segment, I thought I'd just put on screen the sort of results so far. So the Conservatives have won. They've seen 162 increase in the number of council seats, which is, I mean, as you said before, I think earlier in the podcast, I don't think it's ever been seen before, not in living memory anyway.
Well, those sort of numbers have been seen, but it's not for a party that, I mean, it's not record breaking in the sense that this has never been seen before for anyone, but it's just very strange given the circumstances we're in, that the Tories have been in power for 10 years. Oh, no, sorry, more than that now. 11 years, isn't it? Yes.
11 years, yeah.
And we still find ourselves seeing big Tory gains. So, yeah, their numbers have been seen before in places, but it's very strange that a Labour Party, which has already been decimated in the past, be decimated once again.
Yes, and I think it's going to be a long road for recovery. Whether that be under Keir Starmer, probably in the long term, no. But I guess he as we said before, he's a figure of stability, if nothing else. Though I think he lacks the sort of energy to drive the party forward. But that's just a personal take. I think, as you were right though, getting rid of him would probably result in a collapse of the modern Labour Party as we know it.
Yeah, I mean, he has a slight John Major vibe about him, but in a slightly more positive way, because that's not always seen as a positive thing in UK politics, is it? When people say John Major, they get offended. No, he's not weak or spineless. That's not what I'm trying to say. But he very much he's a safe pair of hands for a party that could be divided. And I honestly think had Corbyn still been in power, it would have been even worse. This would have been. I think this sort of shock was always coming, given how well the vaccination program and things have gone as well. The Tories are sort of, everyone seems to have forgotten the sort of gross incompetence of the Tories when the pandemic was in its midst, at the height of the pandemic a couple months ago, or this wave. Yes, we'll see. I guess Keir Starmer will he reign free and become prime minister? Who knows? Will it take him 15 years? Probably. By that point, I reckon Corbyn might come back from under the grave and start throwing red flags about the place and try and do another revolution. But
so, moving on from the UK local elections and I guess the calamities facing the Labour Party, we're now going on to a slightly more, I guess, positive note. A positive, I mean, obviously it would already be a positive note if you're a Tory voter or Tory sympathiser, not so much if you're, a massive supporter of Labour. But anyway, the UK economy is set to grow at its fastest rate in more than 70 years. Now, obviously there's a massive caveat to this in a COVID-shaped way. This isn't massive growth off sort of in normal economic times. As we all know, the economy has suffered quite significantly as a result of the pandemic. So essentially in 2020 there was a contraction of about, where it says in the article, 9.9%. And essentially this is a beginning of a recovery, I guess, from that massive dip in GDP. And well, it's quite a significant recovery rate, around 7% and a bit, maybe hints at a V-shaped recovery, and I'm sure we'll go into what a V-shaped recovery is and all the different types of recovery in economic theory. But yeah, I mean, it's reassuring news. It shows that, I mean, obviously assuming that this second or whatever number wave it is now that might arrive in the winter, it shouldn't obviously be a smaller peak, and any sort of economic damage done in that quarter shouldn't be too significant. I don't know, what do you think? What do you make of this sort of recovery?
Well, I would say it's promising. I guess it's nothing unexpected. I think it's really the bare minimum from what we would expect as economists. I mean, I think if with this V shape that we need, I mean, they've given the way that COVID's affected the economy, most of the economy's just been closed off. Absolutely, isn't it? There hasn't been. I mean, there were obviously demand effects that we've seen, but I mean, literally, it's just a case that shops haven't even been able to open. So that's why the output literally just stopped right there. So this isn't a surprise. The V shape should be the sort of natural progression we've seen. Sort of any other measure of growth that would have been weaker than that, if we'd got 5-6%, I think there would have been disappointment. But it's just a case of whether this is sustainable now, and then really the real question is obviously, will, as you say, a second peak potentially, well, not second or third or whatever we're in now, will another peak, we'll call it that, happen potentially towards the end of the summer or going into the winter, autumn winter time? Will that cause things to be closed down again and affect all our lives and shut the economy down? Possibly. We hope not, but that's really going to be what determines how strongly the UK economy does actually grow, and if we hit that sort of around that 7% target or not.
Yes, and perhaps we should go into like the reasons why we're seeing this sort of growth rate, which is I think slightly above the Bank of England's initial expectations. I think they're expecting around 7%, closer to 8, about 7.75%. And obviously, I think the biggest thing, and the article we're sort of sourcing this from, talks about the unemployment, and obviously there is a correlation between your growth rate and your unemployment. So for those that are perhaps new to economics, or perhaps just want a refresher, your real GDP is basically determined at a fundamental level by your aggregate demand and your aggregate supply, essentially. And basically what a lower unemployment rate, which we've seen here, it's lower than expected, means it means obviously you have more people earning money, enough money to have a disposable income which they can use to consume goods with. And also you've got to take into account things like the furlough scheme as well, which was
we have to put by proper term, the job retention scheme.
Is that what
Learn
it's
from
called?
Boris. That's what it's called. Learn from Boris. From within his own flat, he came up with that. His own flat, yeah.
What, the one he paid for, right?
He paid for, you know.
Yeah, nobody else,
He
obviously.
covered the costs.
Yeah. So yeah, the furlough scheme, which obviously subsidises employees' wages, obviously has helped give people a form of income. Although interestingly, I say all this from a theoretical point of view, this is all correct. But then I remember reading in this article that it talks about actually people, even though they've been earning money, have actually been, well, I guess as you said, because the shop's been closed, they've been saving money. An extra £150 billion has been saved over the course of the last year. And although the bank is expecting that some of that money, obviously, they'll start spending some of that money once everything's sort of back to normal, which should obviously contribute to that, that growth rate, as that your function of consumption is increasing, even assuming everything else remains the same. Which in reality never happens, because there's so many variables. Because you have in AD, you have consumption, government spending, which we would expect to decrease. You would expect anyway. Even through the furlough scheme and all that sort of stuff. But I'd imagine the consumption should compensate for that.
Yeah, I mean, we've also got to think of the supply side as well. I mean, we focus on demand here because in the UK it's the biggest determinant of what the sort of real GDP level we're operating at. But let's say a supply side, let's try and imagine that you're a builder, and I don't know, maybe you build flats, and you haven't been paid properly, you haven't been given the right invoice by the person, you're waiting on payments. It's been very painful. It's been very tough for a supply side sort of point of view as well. There's been issues with the chains of imports and exports. Obviously, the canal incident didn't help, but one boat single-handedly nearly plunged us back into the dark ages. But you're sort of moving that aside, there have been issues with sort of the movement of goods to and from nations. The UK is a heavy importer, so then raw inputs that we need to make goods and services that we all consume been delayed in cases, or more expensive, or harder to navigate. That's why we saw shortages around summer last year and sort of like around that time. So it's been a complicated time, but yeah, no, you've got to really sympathise, especially for the people who build flats.
Oh yes, of course, and I completely forgot actually about the whole Suez Canal incident. Actually, it feels like ages ago, even though it was what,
It does, doesn't it?
a few weeks ago.
Last time that happened, I think we were here. I was here. I was recording at university. That's how long it's been. A good 6. No, actually, how long has it been since the Suez Canal?
I think it's only been a month or so, surely. I don't think.
Oh, okay, it might have been a month, but yeah, it seems so long ago, and everyone's forgot about it. But at the time, people could shut up about it, could they?
Just this one man that's, or the driver, whoever it was, managing to crash, essentially crash into a bank, crash in a straight line, which is rather impressive.
Something that you would do.
Oh yeah, no, of course. Hold on, I passed first time. If you really want to go down that route.
Well, I should have passed first time. I was mugged off. That was a clean test, all right? Nothing wrong with it at all.
Not
apparently checking your blind spots is a bad thing, kids. Remember.
Well,
not my words. The words of, I'm not going to say his name, but one man at a driving test centre place. It's bad to check your blind spot that many times. Bad. Clearly, in the Suez Canal, the captain didn't check his blind spots, did he?
Well, I think he was probably too busy checking his blind spots behind him.
Oh, yeah, of course, that's how you would interpret it, wouldn't you? Yeah, that's how that driving instructor would interpret it as well. Yeah, no, he was too busy checking his blind spots that he crashed. Yeah.
Well, because he wasn't looking where he was going, clearly.
True. Yeah, you can't do that. Anyway, we're moving away from the important point here. Not about checking blind spots and boats crashing. It's been a very hard year, economically speaking. So, the main point of this really is that we have an idea as economists from the Bank of England's projections and stuff as to how the UK's sort of economic output should look this year, how it should look. But as we know, there are going to be so many things that will impact on its performance between now and the end of the year that will change that number. There's no way to get exactly that number. We could, the more likely case is that there will be some sort of restrictions possibly later on again. Maybe not to the full extent of a lockdown, but maybe the closing of some services-based industries again, and that will have an impact on growth. It might not put us into another recession, but it will certainly weaken it, you'd expect. But then again, the opposite could happen. We could see a big boost, as Martin said, a lot of money in the pandemic. And although when you think of a household that saving money is a good thing, as economists, we tend to think of too much saving as a bad thing because it drives out of consumption. If you think of a simple equation where you have your disposable income after tax, the only two things you can really do with it are consume, i.e. spend, or save. And consuming, spending releases money to the economy and generates jobs. Saving just holds it in a bank, and yes, you can use that money to invest, but consumption still makes up the sort of mighty meat, if you like, of the UK economy's output. So we have to be careful there. I think if we see more savings being spent, we might see higher output. But again, there's a lot of, as they would say, noise with their numbers because we just don't know yet. We're basing this, surveys and indications of people's and confidence.
Yes, and the fact that people have been saving so much, and in fact, even in the article it goes on to the fact that people will still be quite hesitant with their spending. There's still a lack of consumer confidence within the economy. So obviously, a question might be raised of how do you deal with that? And it's not an easy answer. Consumer confidence is not really a black and white figure. As Dan says, you're basing it off surveys essentially, which are only ever so accurate. And then obviously you can look at their consumption habits from an objective point of view, and use statistical models and all that. But the actual act of encouraging people to go out and spend, I guess you could argue one scheme that was attempted to, that was like the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which we had last year. Is a way of encouraging people to essentially go out and spend their money. So you might see other schemes like that, although they are very expensive. So I obviously wouldn't expect the government, especially with a deficit they'd be running at the moment, I don't expect that sort of thing to maybe come to fruition. The other thing, I wanted to point out is that you talked about savings, and I'm trying to remember, like, isn't there a whole theory about basically more savings is good for the economy? I can't remember the name of it.
Yeah, this is the Harrod-Domar model you're thinking of, I believe.
Yeah.
Is that literally just on the top of my head, actually? It's been a while, so I can't just remember. I
Very
believe I
impressive.
can remember that.
Yeah.
Yes, this Harrod-Domar model, that's mostly in developing countries. So it's a basic idea that, or off the top of my head, in development economics, we suggest that to explain the rate of economic growth in a country, we have to think of it in terms of saving capital. So without getting too technical, output or economic output can be measured or is a function of the capital you have in the economy, the capital stock, so all the raw goods that we use to make things, and skipping a load of assumptions about marginal product and things like that. Capital is necessary for output, and you get capital through savings because savings equal investment. And so essentially, if we are to measure growth, we have to look at the change in capital, which is a sort of function of the investment minus depreciation. But essentially, the level of savings in the economy gives us an idea as to how much capital, and that then tells us how much output. But that is used more in sort of developing nations. It doesn't apply very well to sort of a developed nation like the UK today.
Yeah, I mean, obviously investment still is massively important, but you've also got to consider obviously foreign investment, which isn't affected by the amount of people, the amount of money.
Racist.
Sorry.
You racist. Foreign what?
The foreign investment doesn't rely on the amount of money people are putting into banks domestically, and you're completely correct in saying that obviously that at the beginning in developed nations it's very useful to have some for domestic companies to be able to have access, or startups to have access to this sort of capital, because remember that your output is determined not only by your labour, but also by your capital, the value of your capital and all that. And
I should also be clear with the Harrod-Domar model that it's a model to suggest how things have gone. It's not a strategy for which governments should try and increase their savings to generate more capital output. It seems to fit the pattern for developed economies as to how they are today.
Yeah.
But it isn't a wise idea for a country, and a sub-Saharan African country or something like that, to pursue a policy for high savings, because it doesn't really deliver the sort of level of growth it needs. So we're just an element of caution there if you do happen to trend into that sort of topic or development economics in the future.
Yeah, I don't know. I've just thought of one thing though, that how flawed it is as an ideology, as a theory though.
Yeah.
Surely if people are saving more money and they're not spending it, i.e., giving money to local businesses, surely that would mean business confidence is very low, so they wouldn't, essentially get a loan to start for a business in the first place because there's no market demand for their products or services.
In the sort of in the Harrod-Domar model, you have to consider. It considers a different role for consumption as to how we think of it. It sees consumption as a function of all of this output. Essentially, the savings are first generated, which generates investment, which then, with the investment, extra jobs will lead to consumption boosts as well. Although we tend to think of consumption in economics as being sort of like the primary key determinant of sales that generates investment. So it depends from what perspective you look at it. The Harrod-Domar model, there's been a bit of, we're only mentioning it here because it's sort of relevant to what we're talking, to the general field of economic growth, but it's not the most reliable theory for explaining economic growth today.
Yes, and actually, one thing I wanted to mention, I guess, before we wrapped up, you might have noticed that we haven't really talked about monetary policy so far. The reason being that in this case it's pretty much irrelevant. I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, I think the Bank of England dropped the base rate to 0.1% or around that
Yeah.
figure, but it was near 0%. It was near 0% anyway. And in reality, a lot of a lot of developed economies have this issue where they don't really have any wriggle room for their interest rates. And obviously, one might point out to quantitative easing, which was sort of used during which was used more heavily during the financial crisis.
Mm.
But I think a lot of data shows that although it does have a positive effect, it doesn't have a sort of massive. It doesn't generate a massive uptick in economic performance required to sort of pull an economy out of a recession. You need it combined with fiscal policy, essentially. So that's why we haven't really delved too much into the monetary side.
Yeah. We'll sort of pick back up in the future, but yeah, there isn't a huge role for monetary policy conventionally, at least, that we think of in this pandemic at the moment, because it's pretty much exhausted all the conventional means. I mean, QE is seen as an unconventional policy until very recently. So, and that, well, is about as useful as a blunt knife, really, isn't it, in terms of generating investment and actual growth? It doesn't really seem to have done much. So yeah, but there might be a role for monetary policy in the future. I've always been a big advocate for it, and so is Martin, I'm sure. But yeah, at the moment, it doesn't seem as if the sort of Bank of England itself can do too much in terms of policy. But we'll wait and see. You never know. Maybe that the main obviously risk is that actually, as we reach this level of growth of 7% in the year, we may see inflationary pressure, which is natural for a sort of high growth economy, which the UK is going to weirdly be for the next couple of years. So the UK sort of Bank of England might have to, the UK government, the Bank of England might have to act to possibly curb that inflationary pressure if it does start to catch up and erode real growth. So it'd be interesting. There is possibly a role there, but just not in the way we think.
Yeah, and then probably have to counter that by making some small adjustments to the base rate, possibly upwards, but obviously you don't want to make too large of a change because otherwise you overcorrect and result in demand or investment falling too heavily again. And well, I guess this is a good place to sort of wrap up. We've sort of covered most of the stuff, if not all the stuff we wanted to do today. If you've got any suggestions or comments or ideas about anything we've sort of talked about today, then leave them down below. If you've found the video informative or interesting, then leave us a like and subscribe. As always, Dan, thank you very much for your time.
You're always welcome.
And yes, guys, we'll see you on the next one.